Great. Thank you so much. It's very nice to be here. Great presentations already in the morning. I really like that this is following Liv's presentation now, and that you already talked about how important it is actually to evaluate all these interventions and these projects that we do, so that we actually know, does it work, what we're doing, or are we maybe kidding ourselves, and just because we're really in love with one particular idea, are we keep doing that and keep implementing that, even though it might not actually be the best way forward. And that's what I'm going to talk about now as the first one of these speakers, and then I know that a couple of the other speakers will go into more details on other examples, and as you will see, a lot of them will also have been evaluated in the way that I will talk about now, so that we actually do know, does it work or doesn't it work, and what is the size of the effect when we create something like a nudge or an intervention. I'm going to be talking about a research study that I did with a colleague last year in Gothenburg, and based on that study that we did, I will show you how we can evaluate the exact same nudge, the exact same intervention in very different ways and get very different conclusions depending on how we present the data. So what we did here, we worked together with a local restaurant in Gothenburg, and they were interested in nudging people to decrease meat consumption during lunch. So they wanted not to take meat off the menu, because as probably a lot of restaurants, they would be afraid that people would not come anymore, and they wanted to give people that choice. But they thought maybe we can encourage more people to actually order the vegetarian food by themselves, and let's see if we can create a little nudge to change their behavior. So what we did here is that they had this daily menu. So you would see here for Thursday, they would have some lamb and then some fish. So it was usually a meat dish and then a fish dish per day. And then they had the sentence which says, we also have vegetarian alternatives. So every day, already long before we did the experiment, they had 3 choices available: meat, fish, and vegetarian food. But as we can maybe already see, this is a little bit hidden here. So it's really not as prominently displayed, but it is available. So we decided to flip this around, and instead of saying we have vegetarian alternatives, well, we put the vegetarian on top, and this was usually the exact same thing, except that the main part was now switched to be a vegetable or a bean burger or something like that. But the side dishes were the same. And then we wrote, well, we also have a meat alternative. So, right? In order to keep it a nudge, we had to have people, or give them all options. So we're not taking away the meat option, we're just making it a little less salient, a little less prominent. But actually it wasn't very difficult to order the meat alternative, because if the waiter came to your table and said, well, Karin, what do you want to eat? You could have said, oh, well, what's the meat alternative? And you said, yeah, it's pretty much the same as the first one, but instead of the pumpkin, you get, I don't know, a piece of lamb. And then people could have ordered it. So really it was just a very small thing, but you did have to ask. So those were the two menus that we had, and now we wanted to see, does this menu make a difference in what people order compared to this menu? And there's different ways to test this. So what we could have done is say, well, this was the menu they had previously. Now we have this good idea. We want to do a nudge. So now we're just going to show them this menu from now on, and then we're going to see how much meat and how many vegetarian dishes do we sell after we introduce the new menu. And then we see whether that's more vegetarian than before. Right? So I think after having talked to a lot of practitioners, that's often how we do this. Right? We have an idea, we change something, and then we maybe compare that to before, and then see whether that made a difference. So we have a different approach here, and I would say, also coming from academia, this is really the only way to know what the causal effect, so what is really the effect of the nudge on behavior, and not measuring all those other things that are happening at the same time. So it's actually quite simple. We have a group of diners. These are all the people who come for lunch to the restaurant. And then we randomize them into 2 groups. How did we do this? Well, we had this restaurant, as you saw in the first picture, that was actually the restaurant. And depending on where you sat down in the restaurant, you got a different menu. you either got the one which had meat on top, or you got the one which had the vegetarian on top. There was nowhere else the menu displayed, so it was really just what you had on a piece of paper in front of you, so that you only saw that ordering of the menu. But all 3 dishes were the same every day, so everything was available, but that's how we ordered it. So do you think that if you walk into a restaurant and you sit down at the left table, you're more likely to be vegetarian than if you sit down at the right table? Probably not, right? So we can say, of all these people and where they sat down, whether it's closer to the window or closer to the wall, probably had nothing to do whether they were more likely to eat vegetarian food than they were to eat meat. So that was how we can say, well, these groups must be identical in their preferences of what they want to eat. And then we looked, some of them got the new menu, some of them got the old menu, and then we can compare how many more people with the new menu eat vegetarian food compared to how many who got the old menu eat vegetarian food. If we just had, what I said before, just introduced a new menu and would have looked at how many people changed their behavior, well, we might have concluded, great, we have more people eating vegetarian food. Seems like a good idea, this new menu, let's keep it. But it could have also been that just because we ran this experiment in May, more people, maybe it's sunny outside, so you want something lighter to eat. Maybe lamb doesn't really feel like a late May dish, so maybe more people would have chosen vegetarian food anyway. So then, actually, it wouldn't have been our menu that made the difference, but just the fact that, well, some people just on a Thursday prefer eating vegetarian food. It had nothing to do with what we did. So that's really a difference we want to look at. So now I took the data that we have, and I'm going to show you what will happen if we just look at before after. So this is always the same information we have from the same experiment. And what I did here is that this is how many vegetarian dishes were ordered. As you can see, it's 0 to 1 or 2 in the old menu. So it was really almost nobody who ordered vegetarian food. And then this is the meat and the fish, and it's about the same amount. So it's about 50-50 what people order, and then this top line just adds all of this together, and that's the total amount of dishes sold. So as you can already see, it changes a little bit over time, but it's quite stable. That is about 50-50 what people order here. So now we introduce a new menu, or if we would have introduced a new menu in this after week 4 here, and what do we see? We see a decrease in sales. And we definitely see a decrease here in this meat, and a bit of an increase in the vegetarian food, while fish is quite stable. So if I were the manager of this restaurant now, I would say, okay, abort the experiment. This is terrible. We're losing money. There's less people buying. So probably, and especially these meat eaters, we're losing them. So we need to change our menu back because we're losing customers here, and especially these meat eaters. So maybe they hate us now because we tried to nudge them away from vegetarian food. So that could have been a conclusion from what we've seen here. Well, but then if we continue on with the experiment, we see, boom, there's a huge increase here suddenly in sales. So maybe actually people who like vegetarian food are now all coming to this restaurant, right? Is that what's happening? We see meat going back up, so that's strange. We had a nudge here, but suddenly there's more meat eaters. Vegetarian food also seems to increase here, so all of this is going up. And then here, this is after the experiment, we went for 1 week back to the old menu, and we see that vegetarian goes almost back to 0, and this one stays high up. So if we had just done it before and after, this would have been our conclusion. Would have been a little bit hard to say. Yes, we see some change in the vegetarian food here, but we were a little bit worried about these sales numbers. So what we did instead, since we did this, half of the restaurant got one menu, half of the restaurant got the other menu, it's going to be much easier now for us to see what is actually the effect of the nudge, the effect of having the vegetarian food first. Here you see the control area, the old menu, and this is, and now we put up the percentages, so we can take away the effect of sales and all these differences. And what we actually see is that from the first week to the second week of the experiment, meat consumption naturally decreased. So maybe just the dishes and meat weren't as tasty in the second week. So even with the old menu, so those people who got that, also these went from about 57% to only 44%. There was no nudge whatsoever. This was just because some other differences. What I said before, maybe people just like to eat, and here actually was more fish that week. So maybe the fish dish was more appetizing, right? But it's not defective in nudge because it's still the old menu. And then if we look at this data, here we see the treated area, and we see that meat consumption goes down by a lot. Vegetarian goes up in comparison. That same week, if you got the menu with vegetarian on top, it was about 23% instead of 2%. So if you sat down at a table where you got the vegetarian menu, on average, 23% of those people ordered the vegetarian food. Well, if you had sat down at a different table, it would have only been 2%, which is about 1 or 2 people in the experiment. And then actually over time we see, but our nudge doesn't seem to work that well, because over time, this is the vegetarian one in week 3, and in week 2 and week 3, it actually goes down. So what we saw here before, that our nudge supposedly worked better in the second week, is not true. It actually worked less good in the second week. It was just a total sales effect. So that's a little bit of a story of how we can interpret our information or our nudge completely different depending whether we actually did a fair evaluation of a randomized experiment or whether we're just looking at before and after. So now another question, I think also Per Bolund mentioned this in the beginning about meat eaters, is, well, can we nudge everybody? And I think this is also a super interesting question to say, well, we saw that our meat lovers group, if this is a distribution of how much people like meat and how much they like vegetarian food in Sweden, well, we had this bigger group of meat lovers, right? Because here, even with the nudge, we have about 10% of people ordering meat. Well, without it, we only have 2% of people ordering vegetarian food. So we have a strong group there. Almost done. So when we do these experiments, that's also a way to figure out how big are these groups of people who are willing to move. So about 10% were not able to move after the nudge. And maybe if we have this on this vegan, vegetarian side, they were still ordering vegetarian food, even though they were in the meat group, right? So that is also a way to really see how big is that group that is willing to change behavior and which groups are not willing to change. So yeah, so doing randomized controlled trials can really help us take away emotions and our own opinions from the answers we want to see and really use data in a way to just become a bit more objective in how we evaluate our interventions. And just as a little end, so together with Naturvårdsverket, or is funded by Naturvårdsverket at the University of Gothenburg, we're working on a guideline of how municipalities, but also potentially companies, can use this method of randomized controlled trials, of this testing in a very simple way with a lot of case studies, and to learn a little bit of how to do this. And this should be ready in around fall this year. Okay.
Thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
Thank you.